Well,
Sorry.
hello everyone, and welcome to a special Neurodiversity Month edition event at EB. My name is Sarah Sawyer.
And I'm her husband, Greg Nemitz. We lead the Learning Differences Support Group at EB.
And tonight we're going to host our newest Learning Differences Support Group workshop. The Learning Differences Support Group gives parents and at EB a resource to navigate opportunities and challenges of neurodiversity.
And tonight's workshop is going to be led by our guest, Stephanie Romney, a licensed clinical psychologist who focuses on working with neurodiverse individuals and coaching parents. She was a founding director of the Parent Training Institute in San Francisco, where she served for 10 years. She's certified in several evidence-based parenting programs for reducing challenging child behaviors related to neurodiversity. Her programs have led to awards and recognition in the areas of improving outcomes for families.
Tonight, our emphasis is going to be for parents. Stephanie is going to be discussing strategies and tips and tactics for parents who want to offer support for their neurodiverse kids at home, at school, and in the world.
And with that, we'll turn it over to Benedict and Stephanie.
Bonsoir. Merci, Sarah and Greg, again for creating this amazing Learning Differences support group and making events like the one tonight possible. Welcome to the new families and also welcome back to the faithful ones. My name is Benedict Cambon-Reader, and I have the privilege of working at EB with a wonderful support team with some members present tonight and a group of very dedicated teachers and a very supportive administrative team too. So Sarah and Greg already introduced Dr. Stephanie Romney. So let's start the presentation, and don't hesitate to write your question in the chat as the presentation is going. So Stephanie, your turn, and you tell me when you want me to start the slideshow.
All right, thank you very much. As I mentioned a few moments ago, I'm delighted to be here. I appreciate all of you turning out. I appreciate all of the support of the team in helping me to prepare for this workshop tonight so that it is hopefully useful to you. And Benedict, thank you so much for helping with the slides. I had some technical issues earlier, and she has graciously agreed to do the slides for me. I'd like to just talk a few moments about a little more of an intro about who I am, and then we'll get into the agenda and what I'm thinking about for tonight. And you can give some input, particularly if there are certain areas that are most important to you. Feel free to use the chat. I know we've got a couple of folks who are helping me to monitor that, but my intent tonight is for this presentation to be as useful as possible. So if there are areas that you want more of a deep dive in, I'm happy to pivot as needed. So as mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm in private practice now. I actually am coming to you from up in Oregon, but I lived in San Francisco for a little bit over 15 years, moved up here before the pandemic, and I'm licensed in both states. So I have a private practice that's about 75% of clients who identify as neurodivergent. Sometimes they're seeing me for an issue specifically related to that. Sometimes it's for anxiety, maybe for other issues, but that the neurodivergent piece plays into how our therapy is conducted and some of the priorities that that client may have. On a personal note, I identify as neurotypical. I like to be transparent about that because there are people who are neurodivergent who have that lived experience. And while I have a lot of experience and I am continually learning, I don't have that lived experience. My interest in neurodiversity is really kind of twofold. One, I have a number of very close immediate family members who are neurodivergent. I have two siblings who are autistic. I have two two nephews who are autistic. My own son is neurodivergent. And so some of the communication styles, some of the ways of being around neurodivergent folks feels very comfortable for me. And then on another personal note, because I'm a clinical psychologist, my field has an unfortunate history in some ways of not taking a neurodiversity affirming lens in terms of working with neurodivergent folks. And in fact, some of, when I think back of my graduate school days, some of the interventions that were intended to help were actually promoting masking or doing other things that are, we actually know much better now, are due to harm. So there's a part of me, I think, that kind of wants to undo some of this and get my field back on a more helpful track. Let's see, why don't you go ahead and start the presentation? That's a little bit about me. I'll tell you now what I'm intending for this presentation. Let me see if I am able to see chats that come in. I kind of can't. So send up a flare if there's something that's coming in that I might miss. Okay, so this is our workshop. This is what I'm thinking of, Neurodiversity Workshop Tactics for Parents. If you go to the next slide, please. We should have the agenda. Okay, so I'm going to kick this off with a little bit about what neurodiversity is. If there aren't questions, I will just kind of keep on plowing through in this order that you see in front of you here, which is talking a bit about executive skills, also called executive functioning. That's an area that a lot of parents of neurodivergent kids are interested in. And it's executive skills are an area where there's sometimes challenges that cut across different types of neurodivergence. So I have a couple slides to talk about that. We're talking about tactics. So what are things that we can do? What are strategies to support parents? So supporting your neurodivergent child at school. We're going to talk a bit about IEP plans and 504 plans, hopefully demystify that a little bit. And then some strategies for supporting your neurodivergent child at home. And so those are around traveling and sibling relationships, bedtimes, kind of just all of the day-to-day life where sometimes parents need or want some support. Now I have at the end discussion audience questions, but do not take that seriously. That does not need to stay at the end. Feel free to flip that around. If there's something that you don't see here that you don't want to leave this presentation without having answered, please put that in the chat. And all of the folks who are on the team who have supported me in getting here, send up a flare. You can interrupt me. I know sometimes people feel hesitant to do that, but I won't get too thrown off. I really do, as I mentioned at the beginning, I want this to be useful. Okay. And I'll go through a few slides, talk a little bit, and then I'm going to take a little beat and just check in and see whether folks want me to just kind of continue on with the presentation or if we need to pivot in any way. Okay. Okay, so let's start with some definitions. Neurodiversity is the range of differences in individual brain function and behavioral traits regarded as part of normal variation in the human population. This part here, normal variation, is really the key aspect of neurodiversity. For a long time, we've had the medical models thinking about brain differences have been over-pathologizing. And as I mentioned in my field in mental health, that's certainly been the case, where there's been a real push for, well, this is what a normal way of being is, a normal brain, and everything else is somehow outside that and is a problem. Neurodiversity is a different lens. It's a different way of looking at the normal variation among all of us. And it involves appreciating differences and not pathologizing. So neurodivergent means having a brain that works differently than the average person, or the average person being neurotypical. And neurodivergent people may differ from neurotypical people in social preferences, learning style, communication, perception, sensory experiences. Okay, let's go ahead. So you will notice in my presentation, I am trying to purge out as much as possible the use of the word disorder, because it's quite pathologizing. Unfortunately, so if I'm talking about autistic individuals, I will not be using autism spectrum disorder. I will be speaking from a neurodiversity affirming perspective. However, the reality is for ADHD, which is a type of neurodivergence, it actually has the D is kind of the disorder is built right into that. But hopefully around most of this presentation, I'm going to be making a real effort to present and model a neurodiversity affirming lens of these different types. So examples of neurodivergent conditions, again, not disorder, I'm calling them the condition here. Again, we're talking about a normal variation in human brains and ways of being. ADHD, autism, learning differences. So dyslexia is a difference in how people learn to read, how people are able to read. Dyscalculia is around math. Dysgraphia is around writing. It's a bit more complicated than that, especially with dysgraphia. But the idea here is there different ways that brains need to learn. So people with dyslexia can learn to read. Their brains work differently. So they need a multisensory input, right? Different from a typical curriculum, but it's a difference. It is not, it's not to be over pathologized. Now there are other conditions, Tourette's, nonverbal learning disability. There's a question in the field, and when I say in the field, not just the mental health field, I'm really kind of talking about neurodivergent adults, about what all fits into the category of neurodivergent conditions. So some people are more inclined to include what we would think of as some mental health disorders like OCD or schizophrenia, and others do not. So this is really an emerging field. Okay, go ahead to the next slide, please. Okay, these are just some statistics about the overlap. So often if somebody is neurodivergent in one way, there's overlap, like another type of neurodivergence too. In addition to one of the mental health conditions that I see kind of cutting across all types of neurodivergence is anxiety. And there's a real question from a neurodiversity affirming perspective. There's a question of, well, is that because these are neurodivergent folks who are living in a world that was not built for them, or we're not there yet anyway? Hopefully we're moving in that direction, or is there something kind of inherent that comes with a certain type of neurodivergence that has anxiety associated with it? But at any rate, when clients come to see me, for the neurodivergent clients that I have, almost all of them are coming with anxiety as one of the issues that they would like some help with. Again, I'm a clinical psychologist, and so I also do see a select sample. So if they're not going to be, people won't be coming to me simply because they have a neurodivergence. There has to be something associated with that is causing a problem in their life that they think I can be helpful with. Go ahead and okay. Here are some common indicators of neurodivergence. So I'm thinking about this from a parent's perspective. What are some clues that your child may be neurodivergent in some way? Starting from the top, uneven development or skills. So neurodivergent kids may be reading at age 3, or very advanced in some areas, and then in some areas, behind the neurotypical development. If you think about, if you take your child to a pediatrician and you have the checklists that they often give, is your child doing this yet? Your child's, can they stand on one foot? Can they do this? And all of those things. Neurodivergent kids are often can do, they're advanced in some areas and they're lagging or not yet developed in other areas compared to neurotypical kids. The next one's inconsistent or fluctuating abilities. So as a parent, you may think, why is my child able to do homework some nights and then other nights has a complete meltdown and can't do homework? Or why is hygiene all of a sudden an issue? They were able to take a shower, a couple days ago, but now they just can't. So I have a slide that talks a little bit about that, but that is a sign if your child has certain skills that they know how to do, but they're not able to do those consistently. That may be a sign of neurodivergence. This third one, internal sense of being different from others. This, I certainly have some child clients who are able to share this, but this is really drawn more from adults who are neurodivergent, who maybe have sought a diagnosis later in life, or maybe they didn't, because sometimes that's expensive, and self-diagnosis is valid, within the neurodiversity affirming framework. But there's always a sense of something was different for me than it was for other kids growing up. I always felt somehow like they were going left, I was going right, or certain things just seemed harder for me or more complex. It's something across different types of neurodivergent, a sense that adults looking back talk about, that they've had that sense of I'm different somehow. They can't quite put their finger on it sometimes if they don't have a diagnosis, for example. Problems with organization and executive skills. I have a whole little section on that. There's a bit about executive skills are the skills that we need it's a set of skills really, to get a project or a task, something done that we want to get done. And it involves time management, it involves prioritizing, it involves the ability to not get distracted. It involves being able to what we call task initiation, being able to start something and stay motivated and estimate time. Lots of different skills come together, and across multiple kinds of neurodivergent problems with organization and executive skills. Organization actually is one of the executive skills, but kind of rise to the top. So if you're seeing that in your child, so you're looking at the backpack and you think, what kind of cyclone just came through here, especially a child who really is trying to do well in school or is interested in what their teacher thinks. Just things are hard to stay organized. I think that's something that's really common for neurodivergent folks. And then the last one, I don't know if we would see this on a checklist anywhere else, but are any of your relatives neurodivergent? I mean, certainly when I look at my family, I'm like, okay, yep. Okay. I can look at my son and go, I see that you're like your uncle, or so neurodivergence tends to run in families. And that is something that is very encouraging, because then there's hopefully more understanding from generation to generation. But that's something for that if you're thinking, is this neurodivergence? Okay, well, are there other neurodivergent folks in my family? It's something to consider. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about spoon theory for just a few moments, and then we're going to take that beat that I talked about and just see if folks would prefer that I kind of plow on, or if there are questions that are coming up in the chat. So if you have burning questions now is probably a good time to think about putting them in the chat while I'm talking about spoon theory. Okay. So spoon theory was coined by Christine Miserandino, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing her name correctly, in 2003. So it's not something new. And it did not, it wasn't originally coined in reference to neurodivergent folks, but it seems to really resonate with the neurodivergent community. She was speaking about talking about spoon theory with regard to a chronic health condition where she really had to balance her energy expenditure. And she was talking to a friend at dinner, so hence the spoons, because there was silverware on the table and that's what was used. And she described it this way, I'm clearly paraphrasing, but it's I only have so much energy each day. And it's like if I wake up and at the beginning of the day, I have 10 spoons, and each of the spoons represent my energy. If I'm going to come out to dinner with you, that means that's going to cost me a certain number of spoons. So if I want to come out to dinner, that might be 4 spoons. Well, I only have 6 other spoons. And there are spoons that are needed for me getting dressed. Again, chronic physical pain condition. There are if I need to go to work, that's some other spoons. If if there are sensory issues that come up where I've got an itchy tag, right? This is not hers. This is more on the neurodivergent. But the idea here is it's describing, in a way, a cumulative stress model. Right, there's increasing. We have only so much, and then we're out of spoons. But it makes it more friendly to think about spoons. And what's interesting is this concept of I really need to balance my energy. I might be out of spoons. I see on social media quite a bit in autistic groups or ADHD groups where adults will say, "I'll give a quick answer, but I don't have the spoons to go into it." So it's used quite a bit. What is, I think, really important about spoon theory from a parent's perspective, and certainly for me as a clinician, is for neurodivergent folks, there are spoons that get spent that may be invisible to neurotypical people. And so that's something when we think about, well, why is my child not able to do homework today? Well, what has happened at school? Were they having to listen to the buzzing of a fluorescent light that didn't bother anyone else in the room, but really bothers them? And there go some of their spoons. What is happening? A dynamic that often parents of neurodivergent kids see is child is holding it together at school. And by holding it together, I mean masking. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And then they crash at home. Right. So you may get the report from teachers, "Oh, your child is doing so well liked, all of this." And then you've just got this completely, crushed, exhausted. And that can look different for different kids. So it can just be a complete withdrawal. It could be a shutdown. It could be having a meltdown, emotion dysregulation. It might be not being able to do those things that they can do if they haven't used all their spoons. I have a little note here. Spoons may be depleted by masking. Masking is a term used for when neurodivergent folks try to act like normal, act neurotypical. And so this may be, typically masking we think of as something that is not healthy for neurodivergent folks. And it certainly goes through spoons really quickly. So if there is an autistic child that is not comfortable in making eye contact and it's something that is pushed on them, there go some spoons right there. If there is a child who really needs to fidget and move around in order to pay attention, and they're told, well, we do whole body listening here and you should need to sit still, they might get through the day, but there go some spoons, right? Because they're moving in ways that are not natural for them. They're masking. Okay. A couple of other things that can deplete spoons typically are making decisions. So sometimes neurotypical folks like to have things automated for that reason. You may wonder, why are we eating the same thing each day or wearing clothes? If you find something that works, it can reduce that load of making decisions. Again, I won't speak about all neurodivergent folks, but this is what my clients have shared with me, and executive skills, right? And we'll talk about that next after I take this beat, but there's a real time suck, a spoon suck, I should say. Like the spoons just go if something needs to be planned and attention needs to be focused. Those executive skills really take up a lot of spoons. Okay, I am taking the beat that I promised. So shall I take a little peek? Has anyone been looking in the chat? Are there any questions that have come up that I should be attending to now? Let me see if I can see it. I'll read it for myself.
Apparently no, right?
Whoops. Oh, okay. So nothing yet. I see nothing yet, right? Does everyone feel okay with me just continuing on then?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I don't have gallery view, so I can't see all of you, but the few people I see, I saw thumbs up. So I'm going to just keep on trucking here. Okay, so this next section is about executive skills. You may have heard it called executive functions, and I alluded to it earlier. I mentioned it. It's the set of complex brain functions needed to execute tasks to accomplish a goal. You could just go on to the next slide. Okay, so here's it on the right. Here are some things that a typical child might need to do. You can see in the middle, the green part where it says to accomplish the goal. So everything around it is, in order to get that goal accomplished, here's all the pieces that not only have to be working, they have to be working in the right order and with the correct intensities to make the thing happen. Planning or prioritizing, self-motivating. So that's really kind of, how do I keep motivation going, especially if it's not something I prefer to do, I'm not interested in. Getting started, that sort of the inertia of we are sitting where we are, I have to start something new. Sometimes that actually plays into planning and prioritizing, like I'm not sure what I need to do, and so I can't get started until I can see the whole thing. But sometimes there's actually just a body at rest, staying at rest, and hard to get things started phenomenon that can be at play here too. Staying organized, managing time, inhibiting distractions, managing emotions, being flexible. Okay, and this is all with kind of the eyes on the prize. We're trying to get whatever that task is done. So some examples are cleaning your room. In some ways that might be easier than some of the others because you could do that on your own. However, managing the overwhelm of seeing the room. I don't know if any of you have ever had or seen a really messy room and you just think, where do I start? First, I'm just gonna go do something in a different room, right? If that load gets too hard with the executive skills, there could be a lot of avoidance of the whole thing. All right, completing group projects, that's a big one, especially having kind of completing a book report. A book report actually is a particularly tricky one because it's usually something that's over time. So there are multiple steps. You've got to read the book first. Maybe you need to outline it or make notes. You need to figure out what's most important in the book to highlight it. Those multiple steps are where executive skills come into play. And so a challenge or a weakness in any of these areas, or maybe you don't always have a weakness in this area, but boy, you've spent all your spoons and there's just no way I can plan what I need to do next. Book report, yeah, being on a school sports team, right? So not telling off the coach, that's okay, you can move on. Sometimes I can just keep on talking. So the prefrontal cortex, that glowing red part, is the part where the executive functions are kind of housed. It's the last part of the brain to develop. We go kind of up, I'm doing gestures. I don't know that anyone can see me. Hopefully you're looking at the screen, but we're going from the back forward. And so for the prefrontal cortex does not fully complete its development into adulthood, right? So if you were thinking about teenagers, sometimes not, planning or thinking ahead, right? Well, their prefrontal lobes are not fully developed yet. All right. So frontal lobes have been, and the executive skills have been described using this metaphor of a movie director. So often it's not, someone who has difficulty with executive functions can likely do every one of those skills. They can plan, they can prioritize, maybe not all at the same time. The movie director is, here are all the moving pieces, right? If you think of each of those, the planning, the prioritizing, each of those, what were those hexagons that we had, that are the executive skills, that's like the movie director saying, I've got all these different pieces. I've got the actors. I've got to have the lights coming in at the right intensity at the right time. How much volume is needed? Who's going to walk through now? What is the set going to look like? All of those pieces need to come together. So you can see if there's a challenge here with executive skills, that it's going to be really hard to get anything done. And what's really painful about having a weakness with executive skills is it can look to someone who doesn't know like laziness. And I see my clients calling themselves lazy. Oh, I just didn't get that done. But it is not laziness. It is a weakness with executive skills. And so we'll talk more maybe down the road if anyone is interested in like the debate of like, well, should I seek a diagnosis or not seek a diagnosis? But when I think about that, in my experience, my clients will fill in the gaps with their own understanding. If they're not able to get things done that they see their peers getting done, the gaps they fill in are often negative about themselves and untrue. I can't learn, I'm dumb, I'm lazy, that kind of thing. Okay, that's a little bit of a tangent. So movie director metaphor, we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so here's an example. This is from a book by Sharon Celine, she's written quite a bit and done a lot of work around ADHD. And I listened to her speak at different times. She talks about having a brother who was undiagnosed ADHD, and how that affected him, not having that answer for why certain things were so hard, and that feeling about being misunderstood. So she's devoted her life's work to this. So this is an example. For the book that she wrote, she interviewed kids with ADHD, and there are just some really great snippets that I think kind of bring these kids to life. You can kind of tell their personality. So anyway, here's an example straight from the book about Liam, age 9. So the description is, in orchestra rehearsal, I got in trouble. First, I couldn't find the right music. Then I stood up to ask when the performance was, and Mr. Mitchell said to sit down. Not a very supportive teacher, but I needed to know. I have a basketball game this weekend and I wanted to make sure that they weren't at the same time. He told me to sit down again or get sent to the principal. I don't know why he wouldn't just answer my question. Okay, so and then over on the right, here are the executive skills that affected Liam: the organization, the impulse control, managing his emotions, sort of self-awareness. I mean, even at the end, he has no idea why the question wouldn't be answered. To be honest, I have that same question because I keep thinking, would it really have taken Mr. Mitchell that much time just to reassure Liam for a moment when he saw that he was in distress? But we'll talk about that. Well, what can teachers do? I don't think Mr. Mitchell did all that he could here, but this is a really kind of typical situation for kids with ADHD. And you can see there are executive skills here, but throughout Liam's day. Now, if we think about spoon theory again, oh my goodness, how many spoons are just like disappearing for Liam right now, right? That kind of conflict with an authority figure, the stress and anxiety about not being certain about whether he can do these two things he really likes. Oops, one moment. Okay. Sorry, one moment. Okay, it's okay. All right. Okay, let me take one beat here. I have something that I do need to tend to. Give me about 10 seconds to give just a little bit of reassurance on my end, and then I'll be right back. I'm just gonna mute myself for just a moment. We'll get. All right, thanks everyone for that, the patience. Okay, so let's move on from Liam. All right, so executive skills, as I mentioned when we saw that prefrontal cortex picture, that executive skills don't fully develop until adulthood, which means that we are doing as parents a lot of scaffolding early on and then less and less scaffolding. But remember that uneven development that we talked about in the first slide. It may be for a neurodivergent child that much more scaffolding is needed in certain areas. So this is kind of the neurotypical look, which is, well, 100% scaffolding to independence. And, for some, there may always be some executive skills support needed. Now, fortunately, we are living in an era where there's lots of reminders and you can kind of offload your frontal lobes in some ways. I have most of my bills paid on auto pay. I hate that way. I'm not giving my spoons to that. Some things are done automatically. So there are other supports, but just trying to say, I don't want this to be misleading where you might have complete independence and like, yay, goal achieved. It may not look that way. It may look different. Supports may still be needed into adulthood. Okay, so this next section is what can parents do to improve executive skills? And if you look to the left under where it says improving executive skills, I'm highlighting this next piece here, which is, it is very important that we as parents are modeling and making very clear that your child's worth is not attached to learning these skills, that these are skills that are helpful for everyday life, but there's the failure to develop that in a pace that is on the same timeline as a neurotypical peer should be unrelated. It has nothing to do with the child's value or their worth, right? So we're trying to kind of take away, and I'm mentioning this because executive skills are the ones where children themselves can, when they see a deficit here, a weakness here, they can attribute it to a failing in themselves. That I am lazy, I am stupid, I'm not working hard enough, I'm not living up to my potential, right? We want to keep that away. Those are not true statements and they're not fair statements. Okay, so if you're a parent and you're trying to help improve your child's executive skills, there are really two ways to do it. One, and this one is a big one and probably the most helpful, is modify the child's environment, and or the other is teaching the skill directly. Now, you can teach a skill, but if a child in their own developmental trajectory isn't ready for that skill, you'll probably get further along in scaffolding if you're able to modify the child's environment. Okay, so I have two examples, emotional control and organization. Again, those are ones that I hear from parents a lot, and I also highlighted them because they cut across all types of neurodivergent, or at least many types. All right, next, so modifying the child's environment. Okay, changes to the physical or social environment, changing the nature of the task. So what we're talking about here, I'm kind of doing a little bit of a sneak preview when we talk about IEPs and 504 plans, because changing the physical or social environment, we may be making some accommodations so that the child can learn in a general classroom, changing the nature of the task. That may be more getting into a modification, changing the way adults interact with the child, talking to you, Mr. Mitchell, right? Okay, go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Okay, so we'll start with the first one, which is emotional control. Okay, what does this look like? All right, it means that the child or the person can manage their emotions in order to achieve a goal. Remember, this is all, when we're talking about executive functions, there is a goal in mind, and difficulty in any of the executive skills makes it much more difficult to reach that goal. You may even get in the way of that child being able to reach that goal. So managing your emotions, I think I had mentioned, like, you don't want to tell off the coach, right? If you want to be on the team, right? You have to kind of figure out a way to manage. Managing emotions to achieve goals, complete tasks, or control and direct behavior. What this looks like in a young child typically is that they're able to recover from a disappointment in a short amount of time. Probably kind of depends. A teenager, they're able to manage the anxiety of a game or test and still perform. Okay. And so if we see this as an area that is a lagging skill that is not yet developed, there are children who become very overwhelmed by their emotions. It gets in the way for them of getting what they want done. There's a kind of some bottle rocket anger, right? Family and friends maybe feel like they're walking on eggshells. This is one that, just like all of the other executive skills, if it is a lagging skill, this is not the child's fault. But emotional control is one that often there's a lot more blame associated with it for a child who's not able to regulate. Russell Barkley, who is a clinical psychologist, and his area of work is on ADHD, he said, people will forgive if you forget where you put your keys, or some of the other, or you don't manage your time well. But they don't forgive often anger or displays of anger. And so this is one that can be really, really challenging for neurodivergent folks because of the negative backlash. Okay, so we have the two areas: modifying the environment, how to teach the skill. Okay, the biggest is reduce or eliminate the triggers, right? And this is where, if you're able to partner with your child, or if they're very young, observing what are the things that are setting them off. And I will also say, it does not matter if you as the parent or someone else thinks that trigger shouldn't be setting them off, right? We don't know what that child's experience is. There could be a sensory issue. There could be, for whatever reason, if you know what the trigger is, get rid of the trigger. Give the child a script to follow. So this is often for children where they're in some kind of social situation that is unfair to them. Another child may be invading their space, right? And they are lashing out. So the feeling is valid. It is really valid to feel like it's not okay for somebody to be, playing with your toys, but giving a script, giving something else that child can say or do to stop the child's behavior can be really helpful for some kids. Remove the child from the problem situation and encourage the use of coping strategies. So that's all about how can you support that child so that they can stay regulated. So teaching the skill is teaching kids to recognize situations, like maybe there are certain types of kids that your child just does not like to play with, that might be too grabby with their toys. Also teaching them their own internal cues, like how do you know when you're starting to get upset, when you're starting to feel like your emotions are not within your control. Great. So exposure, depending on kind of what the situation is, sometimes a graded exposure, if it's something the child wants to do a little bit more each time. Again, that's something that you really need to partner with your child around. Otherwise, it can be traumatic in itself if you're kind of pushing them into something that is sparking a big emotional reaction. Teaching coping strategies, that's a lot of what I do around like breathing, mindfulness, positive self-statements. How can I get through something that's really challenging? How do I keep it together and not tell off my coach because I really want to be able to play in the game at the end of the season? And then, rehearsing the strategies. What you will not see in here, that's okay. You can, it's not on the slide, but I'm just kind of pointing out. You won't see and hear anything about telling the child about the size of the problem and matching their emotions to the size of the problem. This is a small problem and why such a big emotion. That's just not really helpful. And it can be experienced, particularly by neurodivergent folks, as very invalidating, right? So if it's a problem for the child and it's triggering their emotional overwhelm, then we just take that at face value and work within that. Okay, moving on to the other executive skill that I wanted to spend a few minutes on, organization. Okay, keeps bedroom, locker, notebook, etc. clean and neat, able to find things when they need them, rarely loses items. Okay, that might be a little bit ambitious, especially anyone who's ever raised a teenager, but in general, if the child is able to find the things that they need. young child, it may be putting toys back, often with prompting, it says with a reminder. And teenagers, they're able to get the things they need, if it's sports equipment or their homework. If it's a weakness, losing items, things get turned in late, not because the child didn't do it, but somehow it got lost along the way. It doesn't have its own binder, you know. And importantly, that this is impacting a child because they're not able to find the things that they need, right? Okay, next slide. If we were going to try to help this child with organization, work with the child to create a scheme, template, picture. So visual cues sometimes help for a child that, you know, sometimes a before and after, like this is what a cleaning room would look like. Having a home calendar, having to-do lists, you know, lots of visual cues, actually showing the child, depending on their age, like different ways of organizing, so the child can kind of think about what will be helpful to them. Structuring the environment. So at the beginning, the parents may need to do a lot of this. So if you know that your child really gets distracted easily and, you know, maybe don't have their desk right next to the window, right? And again, I always emphasize that this should be done in partnership with the child. You know, I am, as much as possible, you know, against any kind of top down, we're going to do something. Neurodivergent folks have been on the receiving end of that quite a bit in their lives. And particularly if you're not neurodivergent yourself, like for me, I would not be able to know, you know, what is triggering. So I don't want to assume somebody else's lived experience, even a child, right? Do a weekly clean out. Okay, so teaching the skill. There's some strategies that can help. I would say the first one that I don't have on here is like, there is a bit of a choose your battles thing here. You know, how important is it? There may be certain things that it is really important to be organized about that are important to the child and important to the parents, and then other things may have to just kind of be let go. But if we're going to try to teach the skill, helping the child find a home for stuff, right, and actually having a home. So when we come in, we put our shoes here, we hang up our coat right here, and we have our landing pad and they're all right there. One thing that can be helpful around organization is, and actually many of the executive functioning skills, is what's called body doubling, which is, you may have noticed that, say you tell your child to clean their room and they are overwhelmed and they don't know how to start, but if you do it with them, that they can get more done. And sometimes, this is also true of homework, for example, sometimes simply just being in the room with your child, not in a way of overseeing, like I'm standing here as a taskmaster, simply being a body double, being and having another person there can kind of break through some of that inertia and get more done, right? This is what adults with ADHD have shared, that's actually helpful for them. So it's something that you can offer for your child, giving kids choices of organizational systems. We're talking here probably for older kids, but is this planner going to work for you? Are other systems going to work? Because ultimately, you know, this is a skill we want the child to have some ownership on, and they might know themselves a bit better. Okay, and that's probably enough on organization. Okay, all right, where I'm taking another beat here because we're kind of transitioning into the next two kind of chunks of sections. One is, this is the supporting your neurodivergent student at school. And then that final piece is supports at home. I'm going to take a look. I don't see anything in the chat. And if I don't see anything in the chat, I'm going to take that as a
Let's
cue.
keep going. Let's keep going.
We'll keep on going.
Everybody's keeping the question for the end.
Completely valid. Okay, so if your child, you know, has some kind of neurodivergence that is affecting them at school, there are two approaches, two ways to get support. And this part can be a little bit confusing. I'm going to try to make it not confusing. And I also recognize that we may have some expertise that are, you know, in this audience. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to be careful not to speak and try to stay in my lane as a psychologist, and yet still be helpful about what these services are. Okay, so many of you may have heard of an IEP and a 504 plan. I'm going to talk about what the differences are, and then we can talk about how they can support your child. Go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so this is kind of just jumping to, well, what can you get? What can these plans do for me? One thing that I'll talk about in the next couple slides, but is worth highlighting is they look different, the 504 plan and the IEP, because they're under different legislation with different intents. So the individualized education plan, the IEP, is under special education law, right? It's under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. I have that right? I think I've got that right. So it's more, the eligibility criteria are more strict, but there's a broader array of services that are available. The 504 plan is actually civil rights legislation. And so the intent there is to reduce discrimination against students who have disabilities by providing accommodations so that they're able to benefit and access the general education plan. So if you think of an accommodation, that would be a student with poor vision gets glasses, right? We're not changing the curriculum. We're not changing the type of instruction that the child is learning along with their classmates, but they need accommodations for them to benefit from this. Okay, and so the IEP, that's on the left side, has all of the accommodations that would be offered under a 504 plan, but also has additional services. So this is individualized special education services. So that may be a child with dyslexia who needs specialized reading instruction in a multisensory way, right? Or in Gillingham. And that is not being offered in the general classroom. That would fall under an IEP. Or a modification where everyone else, it has 20 spelling words and the child with dyslexia has a smaller subset or maybe different, right? If you're changing the curriculum, you're changing the way, the type of instruction, that's under an IEP. And other services like OT, PT, speech therapy, other kinds of services, related services are also fall under an IEP and do not fall under a 504 plan. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is, I apologize for, I'm looking at this now and it is really bright. I don't know if you sitting at home are also feeling kind of shocked awake here, but hopefully this is legible and readable and maybe printed out in grayscale if needed. But here's the IEP summary. What is the IEP? A blueprint for a child's special education. Remember, this is under special education law. It's a special education law for children with disabilities, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, because that's the legislation that governs this. Now here's the eligibility requirement. And this, as I mentioned, is more strict, more than the eligibility criteria for a 504 plan. In other words, it's easier to get a child a 504 plan, typically. Your child must have one or more of 13 disabilities listed in IDEA. And there's literally a list, which I think I have on here. I'll show you in a moment. And it looks like, oh yeah, and the next one down, the disability must affect the child's educational performance. So it's not just, oh yes, I have this disability, check, I have this diagnosis. The disability must be affecting your child's educational performance or their ability to learn and benefit from the generalized education curriculum. They must need the additional special education instruction in order to progress. Okay. So here are the criteria. When we think about neurodivergence, so autism spectrum disorder, this is one of those few times I'm actually going to say disorder because this is the way that it's listed here. Typically for ADHD, so remember we had talked about that types of neurodivergence often overlap. right? So it may be that for a child who with a diagnosis of ADHD, that would fall under specific health impairment, but often a child with ADHD may meet criteria in a different way. It might be under emotional disturbance if there's anxiety or issues with behavioral control. Specific learning disability, that first one is where we're finding dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia. Okay, so here are the categories, but you can see if it has to be one of these. You really can't go outside of this, unlike in a 504 plan, where it's really kind of any kind of disabling condition. Okay, I think we can, all right. Here are the components of an IEP. So the IEP, Individualized Education Plan, it is a written plan. It always includes the child's present level of functioning, because this is going to be measured. The services that your child is going to be receiving, we want to know if they're working and where they're helping. So this, the present level of functioning, sometimes for parents, that's the hard part to hear in an IEP meeting. And there may be classroom observations. There's information from the teachers. This is where if there's standardized testing, that all of that would be presented to give a picture of the child's present level of functioning. The IEP also has an outline that contains what are the services. And remember, I had talked about it's very measured, so it may be the child is receiving speech for 30 minutes 2 times a week, right? So it's actually written that precisely, exactly what types of services, how long, accommodations and modifications. Okay, so accommodations we talked a little bit about. So that's changes to the environment. That might be like preferential seating for a child that is easily distracted, and modifications, maybe like an actual modification to the curriculum itself. Okay, I think I heard someone. Okay, go back to that if you don't mind, just going back a little bit. Okay, there are goals that are set and they're measured, and then there's actually a part that says for how you as a parent are going to be informed. So there's a lot of eyes on this plan, a lot of check-in points. It's much more. There's a very clear kind of template, and there's also very clear legal recourse, what your steps are, what the steps are, and what your rights are as a parent, because part of that is expected that will be delivered to you as part of the IEP process. Like what do you do if you are not in agreement with something on the plan? Okay, go ahead to the next slide. I'm doing a quick time check here. Okay, here are the team members. One of the things that's required that's different from, yes, this presentation is being recorded. I did see that come up in the chat. The IEP, unlike the 504 plan, requires certain people have to be on the team. The caregiver, a general education teacher, a special education teacher. There's got to be some kind of specialist who can help interpret test results. So a school psychologist and a district representative who is overseeing special education. Right? So it's for the 504 plan, it's a lot more flexible who is on the plan, but these are required. And I think in almost all circumstances, there may be a few exceptions, but all team members need to be at the meetings. Okay, go ahead. To the next one. Okay, 504 plan summary. Okay, so that's the IEP. The 504 plan, remember I had mentioned this is more flexible. So this is the civil rights legislation. This is for for students who are able to access the general education curriculum, but they need accommodations, to help them do that. But they're still getting the same curriculum and the same teaching as their peers. They're not getting specialized instruction. So it's a blueprint for how the school will provide support and remove barriers for a student with a disability, provide services and changes to the learning environment to enable students to learn. Okay, again, things like well, we'll talk about some kind of common ones. This is from section 504, that's the 504 and the 504 plan of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. I think more recently now it actually falls under Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a good thing in terms of rights and supports civil rights law to stop discrimination against people with disabilities, right? So the eligibility here is a child needs to have some kind of a disability, and the disability needs to interfere with their ability to learn in a general education classroom. But it is, as I mentioned, much more flexible about what is considered a disability and getting this put in place. There are less strict rules about who's on the team. There isn't a standard plan. There is usually a written plan. When I was reading up on this, it was saying there doesn't even need to be one. I guess technically there doesn't, but all of the ones I've seen have always had a written plan. So you know what your child is supposed to be receiving. But it's usually going to have what are the accommodations? Who is the person that's providing that service to the child? So like who is doing the accommodating, and who is responsible for making sure that it happens? Who's implementing it? Right, so kind of that's it. That's much more bare bones. Okay, go on. I think I'm also going to take a beat. My next section is talking about what are some typical accommodations, but I want to take a beat here too, because I feel like I went through that kind of quickly. In the interest of time, that was probably necessary, but I can recognize it may be a lot to digest. Also want to kind of recognize that we do have expertise. We are in a school setting, so there may be expertise here for some of your questions, even if it's outside my scope. All right, but I don't, wait, did I see it? Was there okay, no, Jeps, it was just about recording. All right, I'm going to just keep on going. Again, you send up a flare if you want me to stop. So some common accommodations for ADHD. So when you are thinking about accommodations, no matter what type of neurodivergence your child has, you really want to think about what are their specific needs. So for example, I have neurodivergent clients where what's getting in the way of them learning may not have as much to do with the neurodivergence. It might be the anxiety. So I have a client where I've written to a 504 plan that child's never going to be called on unexpectedly, right? So that the child can exhale and be in the class and not spend the whole time worrying that they're going to be called on. So for ADHD and the kind of the specific around that type of neurodivergence, some of the challenges and the accommodations that can come with that are additional time on assignments or tests, preferential seating. Usually when we mean that, we often mean closer to the teacher. It may mean away from students who might be loud or distracting. It may also be, away from, bright, shiny things that might help make it hard for that child to concentrate. Reduced homework assignments, break periods, particularly if this is a child that really kind of needs that movement in order to stay regulated, in order to focus. They may not be able to wait until recess, right? That might not be what helps them to learn. They may need to take a body break, in the middle of the class, right? And so having that written into a 504 plan can help make sure that happens for that student. Assignments broken into smaller components. Actually, this is across multiple kinds of neurodivergence, but especially ADHD, where one big assignment may just seem overwhelming, and that child may be much more able to engage with the material if it's just broken up into something that doesn't seem so overwhelming. And again, these are more supports around the executive skills, right? Well, how are we planning and prioritizing, giving some support around that, and then the child can do all the same work. Okay, some common accommodations for autistic clients. Again, we're thinking about the individual client. So I'm giving some examples here, but these may or may not pertain to any individual. Because there's often sensory sensitivities that go along with autism, that one really challenging aspect of being in a classroom can be noises, different types of sounds. There could be other kind of sensory experiences, but noises are a big one. Lighting that is jarring for some students can also be a complete distraction. So earplugs, that should say or instead of noise canceling headphones, a quiet space. So a place where the student can go and regulate. I'm very glad to see that this is actually more common now in classrooms than it had been when I first started in private practice, where there would be rooms that were not very welcoming if a student was dysregulated. But sometimes what's needed is not just the quiet space. Sometimes there's privacy needs for an autistic client if they're trying to manage overwhelm. So having that written in so that the child knows where they can go and that the teachers know that that child's allowed to go there. Okay. Visual schedules. So this is for, if the child is more of a visual learner, then don't give instructions through auditory. I mean, that may be overwhelming. Visual or written instructions versus verbal. I have that here too. Visual schedules also help with predictability. So for some autistic clients, it's really difficult if you're doing a deep dive in a subject to then have to transition. And so having a visual schedule, knowing when those transitions are coming, so there's no surprises, can be really helpful for that child in learning. Advance warning about schedule changes, right, along those same lines too, right? We do not want surprises. That's not fair. If an autistic neurotype prefers predictability, and that is a way that helps that child to stay regulated, right? We want to do everything we can to create that for them. Okay. I think I saw, I wasn't able to read it, but I think I saw a question come in. Let me take a quick look here.
Yeah, there's a question. It says, do you recommend to evaluate the child over the year as the frontal lobe develops? And if yes, what age?
So the frontal lobe, you're not going to be able to, I mean, there is imaging, but that's not really helpful. What you'd be looking at would be executive skills. If, I don't know, like in terms of a year, it's going to depend on each child, I think. I mean, if you are actively teaching a certain skill and say that's in the child's IEP, that they're going to be learning this skill, well, then it makes sense to measure that. If it's not realistic, right, that the child, maybe they're quite behind in terms of a certain executive skill, right? Well, now that I think about it, I don't know that you would see, I'm kind of thinking about what a helpful answer here is. I don't have a straightforward answer to that, I guess, is the short answer. If it's something that your team, that you're seeing as a lagging skill, and there's going to be efforts to support that child in developing that, it makes sense to measure it. The part we don't have control over really is that frontal lobe development. So you might want to monitor it. You may not do a formal evaluation, and maybe more like, okay, are we, if you're looking at, say, being able to do longer term projects, by the end of the year, is the child able to do some aspects of that, maybe plan out the outline. So you absolutely can measure that. And I would, rather than measuring it like at the end of the year, I would just have that as an ongoing thing to measure, especially if it's something that is getting in the way of the child learning, right? If that's a skill where the whole team supporting the child really wants them to learn. Right? So when you're doing those check-ins, say there's an IEP, if you're getting, say, quarterly reports or half-yearly reports in, like that's something that should be monitored as you're going along. Okay. Shall I continue? I don't see any other questions. Okay. All right. So now we're talking about at home, and I am looking at our time. Oh goodness, it seemed to have gone very quickly. All right. So we talked a little bit about school. Here's home. Here are the 5 tips. For those of you who have not yet heard of Raw Screen or collaborative problem solving, I would really encourage you to, he has many books. If you Googled him quickly, he is a psychologist who's really revolutionized the way that we think about helping children who have what would be called behavior problems or emotional control problems. It moves away from rewards and punishments. I have a whole slide on it actually right after this, so I'll kind of take a breath to say that's my first tip is if you haven't yet, look into Raw Screen. Planning ahead is another one. So with there are often lots of needs, and so when I'm saying planning ahead, if you're traveling, if you're doing, oh, we've got you have spring break coming up, right? Anything that you're doing that's out of the norm, really as much as possible making a plan around that. And I will talk a little more about that. Prevent homework battles, manage sibling needs. These are going to be kind of lumped under the Raw Screen approach, so I think we can kind of cover them there. Then the final one is, and I know I am preaching to the choir here too, because you're your parents, but sometimes we can get too focused on, or really focused on, well, what's not going well, and let's make sure we have a plan. And all of those kinds of advocacy efforts are absolutely essential in supporting your child. And I always just like to say, your child, there is no one like your child. Like, appreciate who they are, appreciate this time. Childhood goes really quickly, and sometimes when we're in it, it feels like, well, what kinds of support are needed? We need to be anticipating what is the next thing. And of course, I did just say plan ahead whenever possible, but I also, this is the stop and smell the roses kind of part too, that I also want to encourage. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. So this is more talking about collaborative problem solving. What I really love is the framework here. So this is the Raw Screen approach. He wrote The Explosive Child. Some of you may have heard of that. He has a whole bunch of other books too. He has trainings that are for therapists like myself. He also has trainings that are for parents that teach you the process. Kids do well when they can. That is really revolutionary in terms of when we see what we would consider as parents, like problem behaviors, right? What it means is if you're seeing something, if you're seeing a child who's exploding when they get home from school, right? So what is going on with them, right? It's not punishing that, it's not rewarding it away, it's working with your child to say, let's figure out what's the underlying problem that is causing this explosion, right? This might be the I'm out of spoons. I'm out of spoons by the time I get home. I got nothing left. We need some accommodations at school so I can hang on to my spoons, right? Not that a child would say that, but that could be the issue. The approach to, well, what do you do when there's a problem? My child won't shower. What am I going to do? Approaching the problem with curiosity, right? We're going to be detectives and figure this out together with your child without judgment, right? Being specific. So if we're trying to identify what the problem is, it's not, you're rude to your coach. It's very specific around, as micro as possible. And importantly, the child is helping to come up with this, right? Coming up with the solution. So it may be, I just feel so exhausted after school, right? And maybe there's something else they need, some kind of sensory input. But the child is an active, this is the collaborative part, an active participant. And then you try it out, and it's kind of like doing a mini experiment. You check in with your child. Did that go better? It seemed to go better, right? It is a way to address behavior problems without imposing shame. And unfortunately, sometimes other approaches leave the child feeling that there's something embarrassing or shameful about their behavior, right? Even if it's something that's out of their control. Kids do well when they can. If your child could do better here, they would, right? They can't. It's either because they have a skill that isn't developed yet, or it's just too hard because they don't have the spoons, right? And you get to be the detective with your child to figure out, what can we do here together? Okay, so this, hygiene issues, all of those, I think there's planning ahead. I don't know if we have time for planning ahead. I'm looking, kind of do. often any kind of change for neurodivergent folks can be really tricky. And when we're talking about a family where there's different needs, there may be different sensory needs. One person might really need to stim in a loud way, and someone else might be really need quiet. Like, how are you going to balance those competing needs, right? Anything with a long enough runway, you can plan for that. So I'm using an example here for traveling. Say we're going somewhere for spring break. Thinking about each step of the process, there may be family members that need to see what that place looks like to reduce their anxiety, to know what it looks like, to decide where they might want to eat. Having a list, a to-do list and a timeline, right? We're talking about sometimes executive function skills in the family may be tricky. And if planning and prioritizing is a weakness of you as a parent, have some support, right? It's okay to ask another family member who's a really good planner to help with this, and check that list to make sure there's nothing missing. Pack needed comfort items. And when I'm saying comfort, but some of those are like sensory requirements. So noise canceling headphones, if there's a special pillow, this increases predictability and comfort. If your child has a hard time eating certain foods, we don't need to ratchet up the anxiety of a trip. Bring the food along that your child is a safe food for them to eat. Make doubles and have a plan to how you could get those things if for some reason something goes missing. Travel itself often uses spoons up. Okay, so I usually recommend, unless you really know your family well and all the players, all the family members, try to underschedule activities. You can usually add more, leave a day on either end to kind of recover, right, to get those spoons back. And also kind of if there's something that's forgotten, you just leave more breathing space, right? If somebody really needs to recover longer, then they'll have that built in. They might be able to relax in the hotel a little longer. Have a plan B. And plan B here is not for those of you who knows Ross Greenlee talks about plan B, this is a different plan B. I mean, an alternative. So if everyone's really looking forward to going to the zoo and the zoo might be closed or it might be raining, right? Have a plan that everybody is aware of. So we're going to do this. And if that doesn't work out, we have this other thing too. And an exit strategy. That means how if something unexpectedly, they're shooting off fireworks, we didn't anticipate that. How do we make sure everyone's needs are met and we can exit if we need to? Okay, here are the resources that I talked about. Ross Green, Mona Delahook is another person who has kind of that same approach that behaviors mean something, and it's don't punish the behavior, try to change the behavior, understand why that behavior is happening. And that's much more supportive for your child. Sharon Celine, remember Liam, the example with him, this is the book, What Your ADHD Child Wishes You Knew. And some of you may have already kind of poked around on understood.org, but it's a really good resource. It has info on like 504 plans, IEPs, really anything around that you might need in terms of supporting your child. It's specifically for kids with disabilities. I think more broadly, we can think of it as supporting neurodivergent kids.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. That was very complete. Can I jump in with one question? I think that could be interesting is how do you tell your child about their neurodiversity and how would you discuss it with the siblings?
So some of this depends on what the child already knows about neurodiversity. So remember how neurodiversity or neurodivergence runs in families. If you're an autistic parent and your child is autistic, you may already be having those conversations. But we're going to assume now that there's either the parent is undiagnosed or doesn't have a neurodivergence, because that's probably, I think, where the question is getting at. There is this question about like, how do we talk about it? And if a child has a diagnosis, how do we talk about that too? Because that's sort of, I think, in the mix. The easiest way to start talking about it is to talk about everybody has a different kind of brain and everyone has different needs, right? And you can use yourself as an example. If there's a sensory need, for example, like you may notice that I don't, after work, I'm really tired and I don't really like loud noises. I like to go hear my quiet music, right? Everybody has examples about different types of needs. The important thing is to have it framed as everybody's need is valid, right? And so if it is somebody has a need in the family, your child, say, for example, that things need to be really predictable, right? Billy is, we call this a meltdown. He's overwhelmed right now because he thought something was going to happen. And for him, having things be like predictable and knowing what's going to happen is really important, right? So this is why he's upset. So using language that is descriptive, right? This is what's happening, and free from judgment, right? So you're informing your family member of this is a need, and somehow this need didn't get met, and we're going to do things to make sure that everyone's need is met here. Right? So kind of thinking, that's the more general term. Now, if there's a specific diagnosis with that, depending on the age of the child, it is helpful, I think, within a family to be able to be transparent about that. But certainly if it's a medical diagnosis, then the child also, has some say in who knows this, right? So I would absolutely ask the child's permission to say, your sibling is not aware of this right now. I think it would help them, to know how to respect your boundaries better, right? So kind of explaining why it would be useful, but ultimately really respecting that. Now you can still, if you're not giving the diagnosis, say the child says, absolutely not, no way. Well, hopefully you've already talked about the neurodivergence in a way that doesn't feel stigmatizing. But kids sometimes, if it's a teenager, they've read things, they don't want people to know, you can still just frame it in terms of needs, right? Your sibling prefers things this way, and that helps them to stay calm and regulate. You're basically describing it without using the label, right? That's the way that I think is the most respectful, and it's also cuts across different ages, and it's just kind of framed for parents as this is how we as a family function. We support each other. We recognize and respect the needs that each of us have, and we recognize and respect the fact that we have differing needs, right? And we work together to make sure everyone in our family's needs are met.
Is there any burning question, and should we keep going?
Hi,
Hi.
so I do have a question about something that I was thinking recently. Like neurodiverse kids have like problem with changes, like when we travel, when like I'm thinking about summer vacation and seeing people you normally don't see, and whereas sometimes situations where like certain like reactions come up, and my question is how to educate, like very briefly, without having to lecture people, to promote acceptance if if a neurodiverse kid has like some like reaction to some new situation, or like some some light noise.
Mm-hmm. So, so that's a great question. So
it doesn't come across.
I'm sorry, I missed the last part.
Yeah. I was thinking, finishing my thought that often people comment or see it as like parents' fault, and like not good upbringing or along these lines.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that question, because there is, I think, a sense of sometimes a lot of judgment of like, might someone think that if my child is having a meltdown, that they, that's due to bad parenting. And that's difficult. I would say there's kind of two pieces that can help with this. One, try to avoid putting your child in that situation. Now that's easier said than done, so I'm not going to like just leave it there, but certainly that planning ahead. So if there are relatives they haven't seen, you may want to have a picture of them. Maybe they Zoom first and they talk to them a little bit, or you're giving that child, you're building in some predictability. So I would say that's kind of the first piece of it. And then you can still be very succinct about what is happening without revealing a diagnosis if that's not something that you want to do. And that simply is describing the behavior. So saying, often when Billy is in new situations with people he doesn't know well, he doesn't like to speak words. Right. So if you had a child that is situationally mute, in depending on, so this may also depend on kind of the relative. Some relatives, it may not be worth your own spoons to educate, right? Other relatives, I think if you're able to kind of describe, this is my child's need in a matter-of-fact way, just like we were talking about talking to siblings. This is the child's need. And ideally, here's how you can help with this. So say the child is having a meltdown, your child, and to say, sometimes in new situations, it feels overwhelming. And what can help is if you give Billy some privacy right now, and he will let you know when he's ready to play. Right. And in the back of your mind, you may be thinking they're judging me, they're thinking, but that's all you need to say. Right? You're describing the situation and what they can do to help your child. It's a reframe for all of us, right? Because there's often a lot of judgment, and there shouldn't be. There is no shame in having a meltdown. There's no shame in being overwhelmed by a new experience.
Thank you so much.
Are there any other questions? Maybe I can go ahead with one more. Is there a benefit of having a diagnosis if the school, like our school, a private school, is going to give the child accommodations by just being aware of it and trying to have the best environment for them? So is there a benefit of having a diagnosis?
So this is going to depend on the family. I will tell you kind of the two things I'm thinking of that could be real benefits there. One is there is a move now. There is a neurodiversity affirming movement. So there's something that can be really empowering. It was a little bit different before we all had Zoom and the internet, but neurodivergent folks are able to connect with each other. And if you're the only autistic kid in your classroom, being able to connect with another autistic and go, oh yeah, we speak the same language. We both have special interests that we are so into, and we're communicating by info dumping, and so there is a place among other neurodivergent folks. What I have been told is they feel like they can be themselves. The mask can drop. So, and a diagnosis doesn't ensure that happens, but it can facilitate that. If you know you're autistic, well, I might want to seek out other autistic people, because I'm pretty certain their brains are going to be working a lot like mine. I might feel like we have a lot in common. And then what was my other one? I think that was kind of the main one. It's sort of like being this ability to be able to find your people that is supporting this neurodiversity view, which is this is normal variation in our brains, and they're there to be celebrated, and there isn't a right or a wrong way of communicating. They're just different ways of doing that. So being able to find others. Oh, I guess the other thing is there is still a sense, I think, for some people of there's something wrong with me if you don't have what the diagnosis is, right? So like a child with dyslexia knows that they can't read. as well as their peers because they haven't yet gotten the accommodations. Now that's sort of more a modification, but there is the concern I have, and this is the therapist in me, this is the psychologist, is my experience is that kids that don't know and don't have a name for why things are different for them than they're seeing with some of their classmates is they will fill it in. And unfortunately, they will often fill it in with something that is negative about themselves, that there's something wrong. So having a diagnosis and going, oh, that's why this, yes, I read this, especially if it's written in neurodiversity affirming language, like, yes, that sounds like me, right? Oh, I'm not, the I'm not lazy phenomenon, right? So I think those are both kind of finding your people and then, ideally having a bit of a barrier between, for kids that their brains might go there kind of like, I'm going to assume that there's something really wrong with me when there isn't.
Thank you. Any other question?
I have a follow-up question about diagnosis. Someone told me recently that when you go through the assessment through the school district and your child qualifies for IEP, that fact that they check the box is not equal to a diagnosis, that it's just like the fact that they meet the criteria for, let's say, some support. So who gives a diagnosis, for example, for dyslexia, if, the assessment and the EIP is not the diagnosis?
So I might need a little bit of help from the school folks here about how it plays out. I think there may be some differences in how it is state to state, because I'm going to say, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'm going to say something that I think is correct, but I want folks to jump in because I'm not as certain about this, but I think there may be.
Do you want to go ahead, Milan? Or should I go?
Go ahead first, and maybe I can just correct you because
Okay, no, it's not a diagnosis. I mean, the IEP will go for goals, and it's really clear. The school district, they're not doing to get a diagnosis. You need to go through a neuropsychoeducational assessment, and some psychologists have the power, the license, and the authority to give a diagnosis. So what the IEP is giving is it's kind of framing a learning profile that make you think about dyslexia, but the diagnosis is not official, if you mean. Now, sometimes it's enough to have that talk with the kids, about, okay, you're not lazy, your brain is working differently. Also going to a school, in public school, the IEP will have almost the same authorities than a diagnosis, and in a private school also. That was my piece, but it has to be through a licensed neuropsycho educational assessment. Is that correct, Milan?
yeah, that's how I understand it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both.
Yeah, it's complex.
Yeah, thank you. So it means to get the IP, you get psychoeducational assessment. So if someone who did that says that your child has dyslexia, it is diagnosis, right? Or not necessarily?
I don't know how, I mean, it's not completely official. Now you go to a neuropsycho educational psychologist with the battery of tests that they did. Some of them probably would reduce their assessment to a few more tests and then give you a diagnosis, and some will, I don't know, maybe some will just take all the tests, but usually they make they need to make sure that the tests were administrated the right way, and just to put just a diagnosis.
Okay, yeah, but then it's like, you know, how important is this? Yeah, thank you.
Carla, you might have some input on that too.
Oh, I mean, IEP is a legal document, right? So, I mean, you have all the important information that you need, you know, regarding at least protections for your child in an educational and legal perspective, right? So,
Mhm.
into that aspect. I think in the end is really what is the information that you're looking for, right?
Yeah.
And what's important for you as a family to be able to know, and how, and what is that official OSAL diagnosis going to give you extra more than what you've already gotten from the psychoeducational evaluation that you got from the school district.
Yeah.
But I think, like Benedict said, you would have to go through an educational psychologist or a clinical psychologist or in that aspect. So to be able to do that kind of evaluation, I think the school districts often try not to do like official diagnoses because they try to keep their own neutrality in it because they're in a different capacity in that. So I think that's why you don't get those official diagnoses from the school districts. If I'm not mistaken, also too, there's that implication. But obviously if they have you know, if your child has met all the criteria through the school district, I mean, and they have an IEP, legally, they're getting all the protections that they need, right, in that aspect. So you'll have probably most of the information that you would get from another things. But again, it's just a match of like you wanting to get additional information, you wanting to be able to get extra supports for your, you know, for you and your child, you know, and just having all those bases. But I think mostly having like that formal or informal diagnosis will not be that big of a difference, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, me too. Thank you, Carla.
Yeah.
Are there other questions?
Well, I think we're up against time. We allotted 90 minutes for this, and we're 9 minutes over. And I want to be respectful to Stephanie, who's graciously given us her time tonight to go through this issue in a big way. And hopefully, you've all been able to get some good takeaways from it. I know we have. You know, a couple of authors that we hadn't heard of, and a couple of ideas and tips and thoughts that were extremely useful. So thank you. Bravo, Stephanie. We really appreciate you helping us out. And if we don't have any other questions, want to remind you that we will make this available, the recording available, so that you can see it and you can take more detailed notes. So that should be somebody's calling me. But thanks again, Stephanie, and thank you all for joining and for your questions. And with that, we will say adieu and take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Stephanie.
Thank you,
Stephanie,
Stephanie.
thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Good night.
Good night.
Right. Thanks, Greg and Sarah, too.
Oh,
All right.
no
Take
problem.
Yeah,
This
thank
is
you,
awesome.
Greg and Sarah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye. See you all. Bye-bye, Benedict.
Bye.
Bye.
I need to stop